The frozen mist hung thick over the Ardennes forest on the morning of December 16th, 1944, when the silence of winter was shattered by the thunderous roar of artillery that would echo through history. Private First Class William Billy Johnson of the 106th Infantry Division pressed his face deeper into the snow-covered foxhole, his breath forming desperate clouds in the bitter air as shells screamed overhead like the voices of demons unleashed from hell itself. What Billy didn't know, what none of the American forces scattered across the supposedly quiet sector knew, was that they were about to face the fury of Adolf Hitler's most desperate gamble, Operation Watch on the Rhine, later known to history as the Battle of the Bulge. In the command bunkers deep beneath the German countryside, Hitler had staked everything on one final, massive offensive designed to split the Allied forces, recapture the vital port of Antwerp, and perhaps force a separate peace with the Western Allies. The German Führer, his hands trembling with the early signs of Parkinson's disease, had gathered his remaining reserves over 100,000 men, nearly 600 tanks, and almost 2,000 artillery pieces for what military historians would later call the largest battle ever fought by the United States Army. General Gerd von Rundstedt, the veteran Wehrmacht commander, had expressed private doubts about the operation's feasibility, but Hitler's word was law, and the die had been cast. As referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive work Citizen Soldiers, the American forces in the Ardennes were caught completely off guard, with many units consisting of green troops experiencing their first taste of combat, or battle-weary veterans who had been sent to this quiet sector to recover from previous engagements. Billy Johnson clutched his M1 Garand rifle tighter as the barrage intensified, the frozen ground beneath him shaking like an earthquake. Somewhere in the darkness ahead, he could hear the distinctive rumble of panzer tanks grinding through the forest, their steel tracks crushing fallen logs and frozen undergrowth. With mechanical indifference, the sound grew closer, accompanied by the guttural shouts of German soldiers advancing through the pre-dawn gloom. Lieutenant Colonel Hurley Fuller, commanding officer of the 110th Infantry Regiment, frantically worked his field telephone, trying to establish contact with higher headquarters. The communication lines had been systematically cut by German infiltrators, dressed in American uniforms, a violation of the Geneva Convention. That would add another layer of confusion and paranoia to the unfolding battle. Fuller's weathered face, marked by months of combat across Europe, showed the strain of a commander who realized his scattered forces were facing an enemy of overwhelming strength. The initial German assault struck with the precision of a sledgehammer against glass. Elite SS Panzer divisions, spearheaded by the feared Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler and the Das Reich divisions, crashed through the American defensive lines like wolves among sheep. In the northern sector, the 6th Panzer Army under SS Obersturmbannführer Sepp Dietrich pushed forward with fanatical determination, while in the south, General Hassel von Manteufel's 5th Panzer Army sought to exploit the gaps torn in the American front. The temperature had dropped to 15 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and many American soldiers found their weapons freezing, their ammunition refusing to fire properly in the bitter cold. Billy Johnson watched in horror as his squad leader, Sergeant Mike O'Brien from Brooklyn, fell backward into the snow with a crimson stain spreading across his olive-drab uniform. The reality of war, that instant transformation from living, breathing human being to motionless corpse, struck Billy with the force of physical blow. As the morning sun struggled to pierce the heavy clouds, the true scope of Hitler's gamble began to unfold across the Ardennes battlefield. The second day of the German offensive dawned with the crackle of small arms fire, echoing through the snow-laden pines of the Ardennes forest. Colonel Mark Devine, of the 14th Cavalry Group, stood in the ruins of what had once been the village of Lanzereth, surveying the chaos that had consumed his sector. His binoculars revealed a scene from Danny's Inferno. Burning American vehicles scattered across the frozen landscape, wounded soldiers crawling through the snow seeking shelter, and the ominous silhouettes of German Tiger tanks advancing methodically through the morning mist. The German plan, conceived in the war rooms of the Reich Chancellery, was unfolding with devastating effectiveness. General Heinrich von Luttwitz's 47th Panzer Corps had punched a massive hole in the American lines, creating what military tacticians call a salient, a bulge in the defensive front. That gave this battle its enduring name. The psychological impact on American forces was as severe as the physical damage. Many units that had never faced a major German assault found themselves retreating in disorder, abandoning equipment and supplies in their haste to escape the advancing Wehrmacht. Billy Johnson, now separated from his original unit during the chaotic first day, had joined a mixed group of survivors from various regiments. They moved through the forest like ghosts, avoiding main roads where German armor dominated, surviving on frozen K-rations and melted snow. The young soldier from Ohio had aged years in the past 48 hours, his boyish face now marked by the 1,000-yard stare that combat veterans knew all too well. The German success wasn't limited to brute force. Operation Grief, a deception operation led by the infamous Otto Skorzeny, had infiltrated English-speaking German commandos behind American lines. These soldiers, dressed in captured American uniforms and driving stolen jeeps, spread confusion and paranoia throughout the rear areas. American military police began stopping vehicles at checkpoints, asking questions about baseball scores and American popular culture to identify infiltrators of precaution. That slowed military movements, but was necessary given the circumstances. As documented in Charles MacDonald's authoritative account, A Time for Trumpets, the German breakthrough threatened to split the Allied forces completely, potentially reaching the Meuse River and beyond to Antwerp, the crucial port through which most Allied supplies flowed into Europe. Captain Robert Smith of the 28th Infantry Division's 112th Regiment found himself commanding a desperate defense of the crossroads town of Clerf. His force, reduced to fewer than 200 men from the original battalion's strength of 800, occupied hastily prepared positions in the town's stone buildings. Smith, a former high school teacher from Pennsylvania, never imagined he would be making life and death tactical decisions that could affect the outcome of the war in Europe. The German Panzer-Lehr Division, under the command of General Fritz Bayerlein, approached Clerf with methodical precision. Their Panther and Tiger tanks, painted in winter camouflage, moved like mechanical predators through the narrow streets. The distinctive whine of their transmissions, mixed with the sharp crack of their 75mm and 88mm guns as they systematically destroyed American defensive positions. Private Johnson and his improvised squad had taken shelter in the basement of a bomb church. When they heard the rumble of approaching armor, through a crack in the stone wall, Billy could see the Black Cross insignia on the side of a massive Tiger tank, its long gun barrel swiveling like the head of some prehistoric monster searching for prey. The tank's commander, visible in the open hatch, wore the distinctive black uniform of the SS Panzer troops, his young face bearing the arrogant confidence of Germany's elite warriors. The sound of fighting grew closer as German infantry, advancing behind their armor, began clearing buildings with systematic efficiency. Hand grenades exploded in nearby structures, followed by the distinctive chatter of MP-40 submachine guns and the deeper bark of American Browning automatic rifles responding in kind. The battle for each building, each street corner, each basement had become a matter of individual survival rather than grand strategic objectives. As night fell on December 17th, the German advance continued relentlessly forward, leaving behind a trail of destruction that marked the high tide of Hitler's final gamble in the West. The ancient Belgian town of Bastogne, with its medieval stone buildings and narrow cobblestone streets, had never been intended as a fortress, yet by December 20th, 1944, it had become the most crucial piece of real estate in Western Europe. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe of the 101st Airborne Division stood in the basement of the town's main hotel, studying maps by the flickering light of kerosene lamps, knowing that his paratroopers were all that stood between the German army and complete breakthrough to the Meuse River. The German 5th Panzer Army had surrounded Bastogne completely, cutting all roads leading to the town and isolating the American defenders from outside support. General von Manteuffel's forces, including elements of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division and the Panzer-Lehr Division, had established a ring of steel around the town, their artillery pieces registered on every street and building within the perimeter. Billy Johnson, who had somehow made his way to Bastogne during the chaotic retreat, found himself assigned to a makeshift unit defending the town's eastern approach. The young private had lost his original helmet during the first day's fighting, and now wore one taken from a dead German soldier. The distinctive steel shape painted olive drab to avoid friendly fire incidents. His M1 Garand rifle had been supplemented by a captured German Panzerfaust anti-tank weapon, a clumsy but effective device that represented his best hope against the panzer tanks that prowled the town's outskirts. The siege conditions in Bastogne were medieval in their brutality. Medical supplies had run dangerously low, forcing army surgeons to operate without proper anesthesia. using kitchen tables in abandoned houses as operating theaters. The wounded lay on stretchers in unheated buildings, their breath visible in the frigid air as they waited for treatment that might never come. Food was rationed to 1 meal per day, consisting primarily of cold canned goods and whatever could be scavenged from abandoned Belgian houses. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment led a patrol through the ruins of a bomb factory on Bastogne outskirts, his boots crunching through broken glass and twisted metal. Morrison, a veteran of the Normandy invasion and Operation Market Garden, had survived more battles than most soldiers could imagine, but the siege of Bastogne tested even his considerable experience. The constant artillery bombardment, the bitter cold, and the knowledge that they were completely surrounded created a psychological pressure unlike anything he had previously encountered, as referenced in historian John McManus's detailed study Alamo in the Ardennes. The German forces surrounding Bastogne included some of the Wehrmacht's most experienced units, many containing veterans of the Russian front, who had learned the brutal arithmetic of urban warfare in places like Stalingrad and Sevastopol. On December 22nd, a German delegation approached the American lines under a white flag of truce. Major Helmut Hennig of the Panzer Lehr Division carried a formal surrender ultimatum, written in both German and English, demanding that General McAuliffe surrender his forces to avoid total annihilation. The German message was typed on official Wehrmacht letterhead and bore the stamps and signatures of senior German commanders, lending it an air of bureaucratic formality that seemed absurd given the circumstances. General McAuliffe's response became one of the most famous single words in American military history: nuts. When the German delegation asked Colonel Joseph Harper to clarify the meaning of this response, Harper reportedly told them, "If you don't understand what nuts means, in plain English it is the same as go to hell. I will tell you something. Else if you continue to attack, we will kill every goddamn German that tries to break into this city." The German artillery bombardment that followed the rejection of their surrender demand was the most intense of the entire siege. Shells fell on Bastogne at the rate of one every few seconds, turning buildings to rubble and setting fires that could be seen for miles across the snow-covered countryside. Billy Johnson crouched in a cellar with 5 other soldiers, listening to the screaming of incoming shells and the crash of collapsing buildings above their heads. Private First Class Eddie Slovik's execution for desertion had taken place just weeks earlier, and every soldier in Bastogne knew that retreat was not an option. They would hold the town or die in its ruins, a grim reality that simplified decision-making considerably. As the artillery barrage continued through the night, the defenders of Bastogne prepared for what they knew would be the German army's final, desperate assault on their positions. The fate of the Battle of the Bulge now rested in the hands of men like Billy Johnson, ordinary Americans who had become extraordinary through circumstances beyond their control. Lieutenant General George Smith Patton Jr. stood in the command post of his 3rd Army headquarters in Nancy, France, his pearl-handled revolvers gleaming in the harsh electric light as he studied the situation maps with the intensity of a chess master contemplating a crucial endgame. The flamboyant commander, known throughout the European theater for his aggressive tactics and colorful personality, had been ordered by Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight David Eisenhower to execute what many military historians consider the most remarkable rapid redeployment in the history of warfare. Within 72 hours of receiving his orders, Patton had to pivot his entire 3rd Army, consisting of over 200,000 men, thousands of vehicles, and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies from their eastward advance toward Germany, and redirect them northward to relieve the besieged garrison at Bastogne. The logistical complexity of this maneuver was staggering. Entire divisions had to be pulled from active combat, rerouted along icy roads, and repositioned for an attack in completely unfamiliar terrain against an enemy of unknown strength. Colonel Creighton Williams Abrams, commanding the 37th Tank Battalion of the 4th Armored Division, received his marching orders on the morning of December 22nd. Abrams, whose name would later grace America's main battle tank, was tasked with spearheading the relief column that would break through to Bastogne. His Sherman tanks, equipped with special winter tracks for improved traction on icy roads, formed up in combat formation as mechanics worked frantically to winterize engines and weapon systems that had not been designed for sub-zero temperatures. The German forces between Patton's advancing 3rd Army and the besieged town of Bastogne consisted of battle-hardened units from the 7th Army under General Erich Brandenberger. These troops, many of them veterans of campaigns in Russia and North Africa, had established strong defensive positions along the natural ridgelines south of Bastogne, turning every village and crossroads into a potential killing field. Billy Johnson, still trapped within the Bastogne perimeter, had no knowledge of Patton's relief effort as he huddled in a bombed-out bakery. With the remnants of his makeshift squad, the young soldier from Ohio had developed the hollow-eyed look of men. Under extreme stress, his face was blackened with cordite and soot, his uniform torn and stained with blood that might have been his own or that of his fallen comrades. The continuous artillery bombardment had created a hellish landscape within the town, where entire city blocks had been reduced to smoking rubble. As documented in Martin Blumenstein's comprehensive biography, Patton, the man behind the legend, Old Blood and Guts, had promised Eisenhower that his forces would reach Bastogne within 96 hours, a timeline that many staff officers considered impossible given the weather conditions and German resistance. The weather itself had become a significant factor in the battle's outcome. Heavy cloud cover prevented Allied air support from operating effectively, grounding the tactical fighters and medium bombers that had given American forces such a decisive advantage throughout the European campaign. The Germans, who had planned their offensive to coincide with this period of poor flying weather, were finally able to move their forces during daylight hours without fear of devastating air attacks. Captain James Riley of the 4th Armored Division's 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion led his half-track mounted infantry through the village of Chaumont, where German resistance had stiffened considerably. The distinctive sound of German MG-42 machine guns dubbed Hitler's buzzsaw by American troops for their incredibly high rate of fire echoed from stone buildings. As Riley's men sought cover behind their vehicles, the advancing American column faced not only German military resistance, but also the challenge of winter warfare, for which most troops were inadequately prepared. Frostbite casualties mounted as soldiers fought in temperatures that dropped to 20 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Medical corpsmen found that standard first aid procedures were nearly impossible to perform when their hands were numb with cold and their medical supplies frozen solid. Sergeant First Class Bobby Thompson, a tank commander in Abrams' battalion, peered through the periscope of his Sherman tank as it ground forward through deep snow drifts. The 25-year-old from Detroit had named his tank Motor City Madness and painted a small American flag on its turret, a gesture of defiance that seemed almost absurd given the circumstances. Thompson's crew driver, assistant driver, gunner, and loader had been together since the Normandy invasion, and their wordless coordination represented hundreds of hours of combat experience. The race to relieve Bastogne had become more than a military operation. It had evolved into a test of American resolve and capabilities that would influence the course of the war's final months. As Patton's spearhead units closed the distance to the besieged town, both sides prepared for the climactic battles that would determine whether Hitler's final gamble would succeed or fail catastrophically. December 23, 1944, dawned clear and cold across the Ardennes battlefield, with crystalline blue skies that had been absent for over a week of overcast misery. For the first time since the German offensive began, Allied airmen could see the ground clearly, and the sound of aircraft engines warming up on airfields across France and England announced that the tide of battle was about to shift decisively. Major Richard Ira Bond, America's leading fighter ace with 40 confirmed victories in the Pacific theater, had been transferred to the European theater specifically for operations like this. Flying a P-51 Mustang with the distinctive black and white invasion stripes, Bond led a formation of fighter bombers toward the German positions around Bastogne, their wings loaded with 500-pound bombs and rockets designed to destroy armor and fortify positions. The clear weather revealed the full scope of German forces that had been concealed by clouds and fog. During the opening phases of the offensive, aerial reconnaissance photographs showed massive traffic jams of German vehicles stretched back for miles along the narrow Ardennes roads, presenting targets that fighter pilots described as a turkey shoot. The Luftwaffe, Hitler's Air Force, could muster fewer than 200 operational aircraft for the entire Western Front, while the Allies launched over 5,000 sorties on December 23rd alone. Billy Johnson, still defending his sector of the Bastogne perimeter, looked up to see formations of American aircraft passing overhead like flocks of metallic birds. The psychological effect on the besieged defenders was immediate and profound. Soldiers who had felt abandoned and forgotten suddenly realized that the full weight of American industrial and military power was being brought to bear on their behalf. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' tank column had advanced to within 3 miles of Bastogne when they encountered the most determined German resistance of their relief effort. Elements of the 5th Panzer Army, including the crack Panzer Lehr Division, had established strong defensive positions along a series of ridgelines that commanded all approaches to the town. The Germans had learned from years of combat experience that American armored attacks followed predictable patterns, and they had prepared accordingly. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment watched from a church bell tower as American P-47 Thunderbolt fighter bombers attacked German positions on the town's outskirts. The distinctive whistle of diving aircraft, followed by the earth-shaking explosions of their ordnance, created a symphony of destruction that Morrison found oddly comforting after days of being on the receiving end of German artillery. As referenced in historian Charles Whiting's detailed account, The Battle of the Bulge, Britain's Untold Story, the Royal Air Force contributed significantly to the air operations, with Typhoon fighter bombers proving particularly effective against German armor concentrations. The German response to the deteriorating tactical situation was characteristically fierce. SS Obergruppenführer Sepp Dietrich, commanding the 6th Panzer Army, ordered his reserves forward in a desperate attempt to maintain momentum before Allied air power could completely neutralize his armored spearheads. The elite Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler Division, Hitler's personal bodyguard unit expanded to divisional size, launched coordinated attacks against multiple sectors of the American defensive line. Captain Robert Smith, still commanding the remnants of his company in the ruins of Clerf, received word via radio that relief forces were approaching his position. Smith, the former Pennsylvania schoolteacher, who had been transformed into a combat leader by the brutal realities of war, organized his surviving soldiers for one final defensive effort. His men, reduced to fewer than 50 effectives from the original company strength of 200, prepared to hold their positions until Patton's spearheads could break through. The sound of tank engines grew louder throughout the afternoon of December 23rd, but distinguishing between American and German armor required careful attention to the distinctive mechanical signatures of different vehicles. Sherman tanks produced a higher-pitched whine from their radial aircraft engines, while German Panthers and Tigers generated the deeper rumble of their sophisticated but temperamental transmissions. Private First Class Eddie Martinez of the 10th Armored Division's Combat Command B had been fighting continuously for 6 days, surviving on adrenaline, caffeine tablets, and the desperate knowledge that surrender meant probable death at the hands of SS troops who were known to execute American prisoners. Martinez, a former auto mechanic from Los Angeles, had become expert at field repairs of battle-damaged equipment, keeping his unit's vehicles operational despite the lack of proper spare parts and maintenance facilities. The improved weather also allowed for more effective artillery coordination, as forward observers could finally direct accurate fire onto German positions that had been invisible during the previous week's overcast conditions. The distinctive whistle of incoming American artillery shells, followed by the sharp crack of airburst explosions, began to dominate the soundscape around Bastogne, as concentrated firepower was brought to bear on German assault formations. As the sun set on December 23rd, both sides prepared for what everyone knew would be the decisive phase of Hitler's final gamble in the West. The morning of December 26, 1944, would be remembered as the moment when Hitler's final gamble definitively failed, though the actual breakthrough came not with dramatic fanfare, but with the methodical grinding of tank tracks through frozen mud and the steady crack of rifle fire. As American forces finally linked up with the defenders of Bastogne, Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams' lead Sherman tank, christened Cobra King by its crew, approached the Bastogne perimeter at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. After fighting through 3 separate German defensive lines, Staff Sergeant Charles Bogius, the tank's commander, peered through his periscope at the scattered foxholes and improvised fortifications that marked the outer edge of the besieged town's defenses. Unsure whether he was looking at American or German positions, the first contact between the relief force and the Bastogne garrison occurred when Private First Class James Hendricks of the 326th Airborne Engineer Battalion emerged from his foxhole waving a makeshift American flag fashioned from parachute silk. The young engineer from Alabama had been subsisting on frozen K rations and melted snow for over a week, his face gaunt with exhaustion and malnutrition. but his eyes blazed with the fierce pride of men who had held their ground against impossible odds. Billy Johnson, who had survived the entire siege while fighting with various improvised units, found himself assigned to guide Abrams' tanks through the maze of minefields and obstacles that surrounded the town. The young private from Ohio had changed dramatically during his ordeal. His boyish features had hardened into the weathered mask of a combat veteran, and he moved with the careful, economical motions of a man who had learned that careless movement meant death. General George Patton himself arrived in Bastogne on December 28th, his jeep flying the 3 stars of his rank as it navigated through streets still littered with the debris of battle. The flamboyant commander, resplendent in his polished helmet and pearl-handled revolvers, surveyed the destruction with the practiced eye of a soldier who had seen similar scenes. Across North Africa, Sicily, and France, his meeting with General McAuliffe was brief and characteristically direct. "How are you, Tony G? I'm mighty glad to see you, George." The German forces, recognizing that their offensive had failed to achieve its strategic objectives, began a fighting withdrawal that would continue for the next 3 weeks. The elite SS Panzer divisions that had spearheaded the initial assault were forced to abandon hundreds of tanks and thousands of vehicles as they retreated eastward, harassed constantly by Allied fighter bombers that now operated in clear skies with virtual impunity. As documented in Hugh Cole's official U.S. Army history, the Ardennes, Battle of the Bulge, the German casualties during the offensive exceeded 100,000 men, including many irreplaceable veteran non-commissioned officers and junior leaders, whose experience could not be quickly replaced. Major General James Morris Gavin, commanding the 82nd Airborne Division, led the pursuit of German forces retreating from the northern shoulder of the Bulge. Gavin, who had jumped into Normandy and Holland with his paratroopers, now found himself commanding the conventional infantry advance through terrain that heavily favored the defender. His troops, many of them veterans of multiple airborne operations, adapted quickly to the role of pursuit infantry, pressing forward despite continued German resistance. Captain James Riley of the 4th Armored Division discovered the true cost of the German offensive when his unit began clearing abandoned German positions. The frozen corpses of both American and German soldiers lay scattered across the battlefield, preserved in the attitudes of their final moments by temperatures that had dropped to 30 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. Riley, a former insurance salesman from Minnesota, found himself supervising the grim task of battlefield cleanup, ensuring that both American and German dead received proper identification and burial. The psychological impact of the failed offensive on German morale was profound and immediate. Prisoners taken during the retreat spoke openly of their belief that the war was lost, that Germany's final reserves had been squandered in a desperate gamble that never had any realistic chance of success. The veteran Wehrmacht soldiers who had survived campaigns in Poland, France, Russia, and North Africa could see that their army was disintegrating, reduced to a mixture of teenage conscripts and middle-aged Volkssturm militia. Sergeant First Class Bobby Thompson, the tank commander from Detroit, who Sherman had helped spearhead the relief of Bastogne, found his crew assigned to pursue German forces retreating toward the Rhine River. Thompson's tank, Motor City Madness, bore new scars from the Ardennes, fighting bullet holes in its armor, gouged from shell fragments, and the distinctive burn marks left by Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets that had missed their target by inches. As January 1945 began, the bulge in the American lines that had given the battle its name was rapidly disappearing as Allied forces pushed eastward, reclaiming the ground lost during the German offensive and preparing for the final assault on Germany itself. By January 25, 1945, the bulge in Allied lines had been eliminated completely, and American forces occupied positions east of their original December 16 starting points. The cost of Hitler's final gamble had been catastrophic for Germany. Over 100,000 casualties, including many of the Wehrmacht's most experienced leaders, and the irreplaceable loss of tanks, aircraft, and artillery that could never be replaced given Germany's collapsing industrial capacity. Billy Johnson, now wearing the chevrons of a corporal earned through battlefield promotion, stood in the ruins of St. Vith, the Belgian town that had changed hands multiple times during the month-long battle. The young soldier from Ohio gazed across a landscape that resembled the surface of the moon. Shell craters filled with dirty snow, burned-out vehicles scattered like toys abandoned by a giant child, and the skeletal remains of buildings that had once housed peaceful Belgian families. The human cost of the Battle of the Bulge was staggering on both sides. American casualties totaled approximately 81,000 men killed, wounded, or captured, making it the bloodiest single battle in United States Army history. German losses were even more severe, with estimates ranging from 85,000 to over 100,000 casualties, including many irreplaceable veteran soldiers and junior officers, whose experience represented decades of military training and combat knowledge. General Omar Nelson Bradley, commanding the 12th Army Group, conducted his own assessment of the battle's strategic implications. During a conference with his subordinate commanders in Luxembourg City, Bradley, known for his methodical approach to warfare, recognized that while the Germans had achieved tactical surprise and initial success, their offensive had ultimately accelerated Germany's military collapse by consuming reserves that might have been used more effectively in defensive operations. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams, whose tanks had broken through to relieve Bastogne, found himself commanding the pursuit of German forces retreating toward the Siegfried Line. Abrams, who would later become one of America's most distinguished general officers, had learned valuable lessons about armored warfare during the Ardennes campaign, particularly regarding the importance of combined arms coordination and the vulnerability of armor operating without adequate infantry support. Staff Sergeant Jake Morrison of the 500th and 2nd Parachute Infantry Regiment received orders to return his unit to England for rest and refitting after the exhausting siege of Bastogne. Morrison, whose paratroopers had held their defensive positions despite overwhelming German pressure, carried with him the knowledge that ordinary American soldiers could accomplish extraordinary things when properly led and motivated. As referenced in Winston Churchill's comprehensive war memoirs, The Second World War, the British Prime Minister recognized that the Battle of the Bulge had eliminated Germany's last strategic reserve and made the final Allied victory inevitable. Though he privately worried about the continued cost in Allied lives during the remaining months of fighting, the broader strategic consequences of the German defeat in the Ardennes extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Hitler's decision to commit his last mobile reserves to an offensive operation in the West meant that German forces on the Eastern Front would be unable to resist the massive Soviet winter offensive that was already being prepared. The Red Army, under Marshal Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov, would launch Operation Vistula Oder on January 12, 1945, driving to within 65 kilometers of Berlin. In less than 3 weeks, Captain Robert Smith, the former Pennsylvania schoolteacher who had commanded a desperate defense at Clerf, received the Silver Star for his leadership during the battle's opening phases. Smith, who would return to teaching after the war, often reflected on how the battle had demonstrated that ordinary Americans possessed reserves of courage and determination that they themselves had not known existed. The technological lessons learned during the Battle of the Bulge would influence American military doctrine for decades to come. The importance of air superiority, the vulnerability of armor operating in restricted terrain, and the critical role of logistics in sustained operations all became fundamental principles of post-war military planning. Private First Class Eddie Martinez of the 10th Armored Division returned to Los Angeles after the war ended, carrying with him memories of frozen foxholes, burning vehicles, and friends who would never come home. Martinez, like thousands of other Battle of the Bulge veterans, rarely spoke about his experiences during the battle, finding that civilian audiences could not comprehend the intensity of combat. In the Ardennes forest, the town of Bastogne, liberated at such tremendous cost, eventually became a pilgrimage site for American veterans and their families. The Mardassin Memorial, dedicated in 1950, honors the memory of the American soldiers who died defending the town during its siege. General McAuliffe's famous reply of "nuts" to the German surrender demand became part of American military folklore, symbolizing the determination and fighting spirit that ultimately proved decisive in the battle's outcome. As the winter of 1945 gave way to spring, the survivors of the Battle of the Bulge could take pride in having fought and won the largest battle in United States Army history. Their victory had not only defeated Hitler's final gamble, but had also demonstrated to the world that American democracy possessed the moral strength and military capability necessary to triumph over fascist tyranny. The price had been terrible, but the alternative, allowing Nazi Germany to achieve a separate peace and continue its campaign of genocide and oppression, would have been infinitely worse. The Battle of the Bulge stands as testament to the courage of ordinary men thrust into extraordinary circumstances, and their sacrifice ensured that future generations would inherit a world free from the shadow of Nazi domination.